Hey guys, tonight we travel deep into the opulent yet secretive palaces of ancient Korea, where whispers echoed through painted corridors and hidden truths lay buried beneath layers of silk and ceremony. Behind every graceful bow and quiet conversation, there were stories that never made it into the official records. But if you look close, listen just right, you'll find the faint traces of suffering, concealed ailments, and royal lives quietly unraveling. You hear the gates creak shut behind you as you step into the cool stone courtyard of the Goryeo Palace. The air smells like damp wood and the faint floral trace of powdered nobility. Guards nod as you pass. Inside, everything gleams, lacquered floors, gold-threaded screens, and robes so fine they rustle like whispers. And yet, despite the splendor, there's a chill running through the palace. Not from the weather, but from something no one dares to name. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, drop your location and what time you're listening. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk past a lacquered screen painted with cranes, and a name drifts through the air. Crown Prince Haemayeon. Young, brilliant, cultured, and dead at 21. Officially, he passed from ill health. Unofficially, no one really knew what was wrong. You follow the servant's path toward his private quarters, now locked and sealed for decades. No one enters anymore, not out of reverence, but superstition. Imagine being born under starlight predictions. Your birth greeted with fireworks and tea ceremonies. Every scholar praised your intellect. Every court lady your charm. Yet as a teen, you began fainting. At first, it was brushed off. Perhaps the heat, perhaps too much reading. But then came the tremors, the slurred speech, the wild mood swings that left his tutors whispering behind screens. Historians still argue whether it was epilepsy, a degenerative nerve disorder, or the side effects of traditional medicines meant to boost his ki. Some suspect the famed 5 Tigers tonic. A blend of tiger bone, ginseng, and mercury might have done more harm than good. It was said to restore virility, but also made users shiver like autumn leaves. You picture him now, Haemayeon, wrapped in embroidered silk, seated on a lacquered throne, his face waxen with sweat. Court painters still had to immortalize him. Of course, portraits smoothed the truth, painted away the droop in his eye, the slight tilt of his mouth. And still, he composed poetry. He danced in royal court performances, though aides had to guide his arms behind the scenes. In one haunting scroll, he wrote, "A star shines in daylight, but no one sees it. So must I shine unseen." A chill runs through you. No physician dared speak aloud what they suspected. Doing so meant disgrace, maybe worse. Instead, royal physicians filled scrolls with nonsense. Imbalance of the wind element suppressed fire, or the classic overthinking. You can't help but smile. Some things never change. In hushed corners of the palace, servants whispered other things. That the prince was possessed, that he had angered an ancestral spirit. One maid claimed she saw him freeze mid-step for a full minute, eyes wide like a porcelain doll, before crumpling to the ground. You duck behind a carved pillar and peek into what was once his study. The air here smells stale, faintly herbal. A tiny writing desk sits untouched, scrolls bundled in silk. You run your fingers along one, his own hand, neat and precise. His handwriting never trembled, even if he did. By 20, Haemayeon stopped appearing at public events. Excuses flowed like tea: seasonal fever, academic retreat, spiritual reflection. But insiders knew he couldn't walk without a cane. He was kept from the public eye, his body too unpredictable, his face no longer princely enough. It's a strange, cruel irony. The boy destined to be king was, for much of his life, a ghost in his own palace, seen only in paintings, heard only in rehearsed statements. And then, just like that, he died. There was no fanfare, just a short notice carved into the bamboo slip of history. His health, long fragile, failed. But the tremors, the seizures, the mystery herbs? Nothing. Silence. The royal court wore white for a month. His mother wept behind a screen, and 1,000 birds were released in his honor. But none of them could explain what had really happened. Today, Korean scholars still debate the cause. Was it epilepsy? A stroke disorder? Maybe even multiple sclerosis? No one can be sure. The records are vague, the body long gone. All that's left are his poems and a few unsettling sketches. Eyes too wide, shoulders too narrow, hands that never quite rest. You step back into the present, heart oddly heavy. It's strange, isn't it? How someone born to rule could be undone by something so quietly cruel. Not an assassin's blade or political coup, but a silent illness tucked behind veils of shame. And that, perhaps, is the most tragic part. His mind stayed sharp. His words beautiful, but in a world obsessed with image, with appearances, with perfection, Hayamayan was too human to survive.
You're still lingering near the sealed study of Prince Hayamayang when a draft curls around your ankles, drawing your attention down the corridor. The light shifts. You turn, and as you walk deeper into the quieter wing of the palace, a different energy settles over you, not the somber hush of illness, but the uneasy silence of things deliberately forgotten. You're heading toward the women's quarters, the gyobang, or what remains of it. This is where the court's entertainers lived and trained. Not concubines, not quite servants, but something stranger, kisareng. They were the artists of the court, trained in music, poetry, conversation, and yes, intimacy. Think of them like high society companions with a mandatory PhD in being fascinating. You hear their laughter echo through time, always slightly performative, always slightly sad. But behind the fans and flutes was a brutal truth. Some of these women weren't there by choice. As you slip through a screen door that hasn't been touched in centuries, the scent of old perfume lingers, powdery, floral, a little bitter. You imagine a teenage girl, barely old enough to braid her hair, being led into this room. Her name is changed. Her past, forgotten. From that point on, she is property. Not of a person, but of the institution. Historians still argue whether the kisareng were empowered artisans or glorified prisoners. The training was harsh. You weren't allowed to show exhaustion, even after hours of dance or calligraphy. You learned to pour tea with your eyes down and your wrist curved perfectly, because even your posture was part of the show. But here's the part that sticks with you. For some of these women, virginity was mandated. Not because it was sacred, but because it added value. Like an unopened book. The state could lease them to nobles and officials, and in some cases, even the king himself, as a form of reward or control. It's like gift-wrapping a human being and calling it diplomacy. You run your hand along the low bench where a group of young girls once sat, learning to play the gayam, their fingers blistered from practice. One of them, a legend says, was forced to undergo a purity test, basically, a medieval inspection by palace physicians to confirm her virginity before she was granted to a high-ranking official. You try not to gag. This wasn't centuries ago in some shadowy village, it happened right here, beneath golden tiles and painted ceilings. In some cases, women were assigned to noblemen not just for companionship but for dynastic experimentation. This is where it gets weirder. One court record suggests that during the late Joseon dynasty, a secret group of physicians and astrologers began cataloguing compatibility between noblemen and kisareng based on birth dates, bloodlines, and bodily balance. Basically, astrology meets arranged eugenics. Their goal? To create offspring with the perfect chi, a balance of yin and yang energies. You pass a tattered scroll hanging on the wall. It's faded, but you can still make out symbols of water, fire, and wood, the 5 elements. The notes beside it detail a bizarre pairing ritual. A nobleman would spend 3 days fasting, then undergo a preparation massage, don't ask, while the chosen woman would be doused in herb-infused water meant to align her lunar pathways. Sounds suspiciously like a spa day gone wrong. And guess what? If a child was born sickly or unremarkable, the woman was blamed for spoiling the lineage. She could be demoted, cast out, or worse, sent to the Dongne medical house, which was less a clinic and more a palace for broken things. Still, there were stories of rebellion. One Kisareng, named Wolhwa, allegedly faked a fainting spell during a royal banquet, landing in the infirmary just to avoid being selected. She later became a spy for anti-royalist rebels, passing information between noblemen's bedsheets and ink-stained scrolls. Historians debate her existence. Was she real, or a convenient symbol of resistance? Either way, her name shows up in more than one dusty record, usually next to a suspiciously ink-blotted sentence. You lean into the silence again. The air in here feels thicker, like the walls themselves are keeping secrets. You notice an old fan on the ground, its silk torn and its spine cracked. It bears the crest of a noble house long erased from history. Someone likely flung it in frustration, or maybe just left it behind after being dismissed without ceremony. And yet, despite the heartbreak and objectification, some Kisareng wielded more power than many nobles. They knew things: who was sleeping with whom, who was planning a coup, who was about to fall from favor. Their weapon wasn't a sword or a scroll, but a well-timed whisper, a perfectly executed smile, or a poem with a hidden insult that would only be caught 2 days later, over cold tea. By the end of your visit, you realize the Kisareng weren't just footnotes in someone else's story. They were the shadows in the corridors, the eyes behind the fans, the subtle hands guiding courtly chaos. You step back into the hallway, the laughter long gone now. What remains is the haunting truth. In a world where even a glance could be a transaction, these women danced not for joy but for survival. You don't get far before the scent of something unusual hits you, smoky, herbal, oddly sweet. You follow it like a thread, winding through stone passages until you enter a dim chamber, its ceiling painted like a starry night. This, you realize, was a private medical room not for the masses, but for the elite. And in this strange, incense-laced space, another chapter of Joseon-era sensuality unfolds, one rooted not in performance, but in prevention. You're standing in what was once a royal fertility clinic, the kind of place whispered about behind fans and closed doors. Despite their prim and proper Confucian exteriors, Korea's aristocracy was absolutely obsessed with fertility. It wasn't just about heirs, it was about power, karma, cosmic balance. You glance around and spot ceramic pots labeled with faded characters: deer antler, ginseng, snake bile. All supposedly part of ancient aphrodisiacs and male vitality tonics. Basically, Viagra if it were brewed by a forest witch. And yes, men weren't the only ones drinking weird things. Noble women were given concoctions to enhance their yin energy and increase their chances of conception. One of these tonics included powdered pearls and bare gallbladder. Don't ask how they got it. The point is, it was expensive, disgusting, and wildly unscientific. Historians still argue whether any of it had the slightest physiological effect or was just really expensive superstition. Your stomach churns a little as you imagine sipping warm bear-bile tea by candlelight, hoping to secure your family's legacy. Now here's where it turns. While the formulas were steeped in mysticism, the rituals were disturbingly clinical. Some couples, especially those in royal circles, underwent state-supervised conception nights. That's right, an official on hand, not in the room but close enough to track timing, symptoms, and results. You probably won't survive the embarrassment of imagining that clipboard meeting. Yes, Your Grace, the moon was waxing and the temperature optimal. Shall I mark it down? One fringe practice that's been uncovered involves a series of preconception acupressure protocols, pressure points stimulated by palace midwives to awaken dormant womb energy. But the locations? Let's just say they weren't all located on the wrist or ankle. Diaries from one midwife describe having to massage the breath channel at the root, a euphemism that even she refused to elaborate on. You walk past a low stone platform where a noblewoman might have sat, legs submerged in warm herbal water, while midwives chanted to the spirits of her ancestors. Yes, this was medicine, but with a side of seance. One report even mentions the use of geomancy to arrange bedroom furniture in ways that would boost sexual harmony. Basically, Korean feng shui, except instead of maximizing natural light, you're maximizing libido. And speaking of harmony, it wasn't uncommon for elite couples to consult dream interpreters after intimate encounters. A bad dream might signal disharmony between body and spirit. A good dream involving peaches or cranes, auspicious signs of impending pregnancy. You smile to yourself, imagining a nobleman panicking because his dream involved cabbage. What did that mean? Spoiled chi? Flatulence in the dynasty? What really stays with you, though, are the documents, hundreds of meticulous scrolls tracking royal sexual activity down to the minute. They were called Sungjeongwan Ilgi, or daily records of the royal secretariat. These weren't just boring reports, they noted when, where, and with whom the king spent his nights. Scholars comb through them today like historical gossip blogs. One week, the king favored Lady Kim 4 nights in a row. The next, she disappears from the log. Illness? Political maneuvering? Or maybe something spicier? Still, these practices weren't limited to the palace. Wealthy yangban, aristocrats, families mimicked them with their own flavor, private fertility shamans, room blessing rituals, even bed warmers hired to prepare the marital room in advance by sleeping in the sheets to bring good luck. Imagine that job interview. So, you want me to nap professionally? Yet beneath all the pageantry and potions lay a core anxiety: failure. If a couple couldn't conceive, the blame almost always landed on the woman. She could be divorced, replaced, or relegated to a life of ceremonial solitude. One preserved poem, anonymous, of course, laments, "My womb is a winter garden, my husband seeks spring elsewhere." You pause at the verse, struck by its quiet devastation. Even stranger, there's mention in fringe records of secret fertility competitions among concubines, each trying to outdo the others in herbal regimens, prayer sessions, or moonlit rituals to become the favored bearer of the heir. Some even consulted early alchemical guides to brew their own, often dangerous, fertility potions. Let's just say you should never mix foxglove with snake wine. One woman reportedly grew a 3rd nipple. Again, no sources confirm this, but let's just say historians remained suspiciously silent on the matter. You sit for a moment on a stone bench, heart slowed by the weight of it all. These weren't wild orgies or tabloid scandals, these were structured, sanctioned, deeply anxious rituals meant to ensure that life continued. But in their pursuit of life, they often ignored the humanity of those involved. Especially the women. Always the women. The incense has burned down now, curling into faint ribbons that disappear into the cracks of the palace wall. You rise and move on, aware that in ancient Korea, even intimacy came with a ledger, a ranking, and a risk.
You step into the next chamber, a quiet, shadowy room with carved screens and silk-covered walls. It feels softer here, less clinical, more secret, as if this space had held confessions, intimate ones. You realize quickly, this wasn't a room for ritual or medicine. This was where women talked, gossiped, plotted, and sometimes where they defied the boundaries set by palace walls. In ancient Korea, especially during the Joseon dynasty, aristocratic women lived under strict Neo-Confucian codes that demanded obedience, chastity, and invisibility. And yet, within those very confines, they found ways to express desire, sometimes tenderly, sometimes dangerously. One of the most taboo subjects, even today, was female-female intimacy. And yes, it existed. How could it not? In a court full of secluded women, guarded from men, but not from each other, bonds formed. Many were emotional, deep and sisterly, but some crossed into physical longing. You remember reading about a case from the 18th century. 2 palace maids dismissed quietly after rumors spread of nighttime visits, shared bedding and love notes hidden in laundry baskets. The records are vague, deliberately so, but the language, inappropriate affection, unseemly closeness, speaks volumes. You brush your fingers along a screen carved with floral motifs and wonder, how many secrets pass behind these panels? In the shadows of kings and concubines, love stories, improper by the standards of time, bloomed like wildflowers in an overly manicured garden. And then there were the courtesans, or jisseing, women trained in poetry, music, and charm. Though not officially part of the aristocracy, they wielded unique power. In contrast to noble women, who were meant to remain silent and obedient, jisseing were celebrated for their wit, their voice, their command of art, and yes, their sexuality. But even among jisseing, certain practices were considered shocking. One such practice? Temporary marriages between jisseing and each other. No legal documents, just vows whispered under moonlight, gifts exchanged, a favored pillow shared. Some accounts mention elaborate rituals, braided hair, matching rings, secret dances meant only for 2. And while many of these bonds were romantic and supportive, others blurred into competition, jealousy, and betrayal. One famous jisseing's diary, only partially preserved, describes a rivalry so intense, one woman poisoned her rival's wine to win the attention of a royal guest. The entry is chilling. Her lips turned blue as the song faded. No one sang for a week. You pause, heart heavy with the line. Desire unchecked can turn deadly, especially in a world where women had few other outlets for ambition or affection. And then, more quietly, there were the practices passed between women, not always sexual, but certainly intimate, in private chambers. Older women sometimes taught younger ones about pleasure, not with words, but with touch. The logic? Husbands wouldn't care, but sisters should prepare each other. It sounds unthinkable now, but in a world that offered no real sex education, no autonomy, and no safe space, these strange little rituals were acts of survival. You glance at an old ink drawing hanging crooked on the wall. 2 women lie on a mat, their hair pulled together like a single river. There's nothing explicit in the artwork, just closeness, trust, maybe love, and love wasn't the only risky emotion in this world. Jealousy was everywhere, especially among the concubines, whose entire futures could rise or fall based on who got chosen by the king that week. It said some would slip mild laxatives into rivals' tea to cause digestive disgrace on their special night. Others consulted shamans to play sexual curses. Yes, that was a thing, meant to dampen a rival's attractiveness or, in one case, cool the fire in her loins. Your modern brain reels at the absurdity, but the fear behind it was real. One lost night could mean a lost inheritance, or worse, a lost child, a lost status, a life pushed into quiet servitude. And what about secret lovers? Not palace women, but outsiders. There's a rare account of court lady who disguised a stable boy as a female servant so they could spend nights together. He was eventually caught. The punishment? Death for him. Exile for her. The last line of the record is haunting. She wept without sound as the gates closed behind him. No scandal. No trial. Just the erasure of forbidden longing. You sit on the lacquered floor, suddenly overwhelmed by how deeply hunger, not just for sex, but for connection, ran through these walls. Even in the most controlled environment, the human heart found cracks to slip through. This wasn't just about taboo. It was about resilience. Women carving out stolen moments of intimacy in a world designed to suppress them. Some were punished. Others were erased. A few, rarely, were remembered. As the candle flickers in a forgotten corner, you wonder, what stories never made it to ink and scrolls? What names were whispered only once, in the dark, before disappearing forever?
You step into a narrow corridor lined with scrolls. Dusty, faded, and forgotten, each one seems to hum with stories people weren't supposed to tell. You pause by a particularly long scroll, its edge cracked but its calligraphy still proud. This one is about the erotic dreams of kings, specifically, the strange practices they used to interpret them. Yes, really. In ancient Korea, dreams weren't just dreams. They were prophecies, messages from ancestors, and sometimes excuses for deeply questionable behavior. Take King Yeonsangun, for example, arguably the most notorious monarch in Joseon history. Historians agree he was unstable, cruel, and obsessed with control. But lesser known are his dream journals. Yes, the man kept a log of his nightly visions, many of which involved bizarre and graphic imagery. One such entry, recorded by an unfortunate scribe, included a woman with dragon's eyes bathing in milk under a silver moon. What did that mean? According to his royal astrologer, an omen of untamed lust and dangerous favor. Guess who got summoned that night? Half the court's female entertainers. Here's the strange part. The king's sexual dreams weren't considered embarrassing, they were treated like state affairs. Advisors debated them. Shamans were summoned. In one particularly odd case, a king dreamed of a tiger mating with a lotus. For weeks afterward, the palace banned lotus tea and embroidered tiger imagery on all bedroom drapes. Just in case, the dreams came true. Historians still argue whether these dream interpretations were sincere beliefs or clever political theater. Did the kings truly see omens in their fantasies? Or were they using tradition to justify their impulses? Either way, It created a strange ripple effect. The entire palace tuned itself to the subconscious desires of one man. If he dreamed of fire, incense was burned. If he dreamed of drowning, a ritual bath was prepared for him using 9 types of flour. And if he dreamed of seduction, well, let's just say, a few Gizaring lost their voices from singing too much the next morning. You lean against the wall, letting that sink in. Today, if someone told you they rearranged an entire household based on a sex dream, you'd probably recommend a therapist. Back then, you'd be expected to light incense and act thrilled. Even stranger was the practice of dream punishment. If the king had a nightmare involving someone betraying him, say, a minister stabbing him or a concubine laughing as he fell off a cliff, he'd punish that person in real life. Not symbolically. Actual exile. Floggings. Confiscation of lands. One unlucky nobleman was imprisoned for 3 years because the king dreamt he was a goose stealing royal rice. Yes, really. A goose. And on the other side of the spectrum, if someone appeared favorably in a royal dream, they could gain power overnight. There's a record of a low-ranking court musician elevated to a ministerial role after appearing in a dream wearing silver robes and calming the tides. Did he do anything heroic in real life? Nope. Just stood still in dream logic. You brush past the scroll and find a tiny compartment at the end of the corridor. There's something eerily sacred about it. This was where dream interpreters lived, the shamans and mystics whose job it was to decode royal visions. Most were women, many blind. The logic, lacking sight, helped them see further into the spirit world. These interpreters wielded enormous influence. A well-phrased interpretation could mean new lands, new lovers, or the silencing of a political rival. But if they guessed wrong, punishment was swift. One misread omen led to the execution of 3 interpreters in 1451. The charge: corrupt guidance. Translation: the king didn't like what he heard. And while all of this sounds laughably superstitious, you get the sense it wasn't just about dreams or desire. It was about control through mysticism. By framing sexual urges as destiny, kings turned private cravings into public rituals. And everyone, from ministers to maids, had to play along. But sometimes, the system backfired. One famous scandal involved a dream in which the king saw himself as a woman, being courted by a man with a voice like thunder and teeth like pearls. The court astrologer's interpretation: you are to marry power disguised as beauty. The court took this to mean a noble lady would bear the next heir. Spoiler: the king fixated on a particular woman based on this prophecy. She was promoted, given lavish gifts. The nation watched. She, unfortunately, detested him. That entire year became a theater of awkward flirtations, stilted poetry, and one particularly disastrous hunt where she accidentally shot the king's favorite deer. The relationship fizzled. The prophecy was buried. And the dream interpreter, banished to a mountain temple. You step back from the compartment, amused, maybe a little unsettled. Dreams, after all, are supposed to be private, vulnerable, honest. But in ancient Korea, they were weaponized. A nightly theater that shaped the daytime world. The candle in this room flickers nervously, as if unsure whether to stay lit.
The candlelight trails behind you as you enter a larger chamber, its walls carved with curling clouds and serpents. You're not alone. Painted faces peer from the frescoes. women in elegant robes, fans hiding sly smiles. These are the Kizang, the professional female entertainers of ancient Korea, and what they knew about sexuality. Well, let's just say your local romance novel doesn't stand a chance. Now, the Kizang were not prostitutes, despite what pop culture might try to whisper in your ear. These women were trained artists, poets, musicians, dancers, and conversationalists. Think geisha, but with even more political edge. Yet beneath the surface of elegance and culture was a murkier layer of control, commodification, and a social double standard so sharp you could slice kimchi with it. From an early age, girls chosen to become kizueng were taken to government-run training houses called gyobang. Here, they learned calligraphy, music, how to pour tea with just enough wrist flick to seduce a stone, and unofficially, how to read a man's ambitions before he even opened his mouth. But here's where things get weird. While Kizang were technically owned by the state, some were gifted between nobles like ornate pens, and a few were summoned to serve ceremonial sexual purposes, rituals involving dreams, fertility, or even calming the wrath of angry spirits. Yes, you heard that right. In a kingdom known for its Confucian rigidity, sex still somehow found its way into the spiritual bureaucracy. There's one case recorded during King Songjong's reign where a particular Kizang was believed to carry the fire of sensual clarity. Translation: her presence could ward off bad luck. So, when a drought struck the capital, she was paraded, clothed barely, through the palace gardens at midnight to awaken the rain gods. Did it rain? Nope. But a dozen court officials caught colds, and she was promoted. Historians still argue whether this practice had true shamanistic roots or was simply a convenient excuse for spectacle. But either way, the lines between performance, power, and intimacy were constantly blurred. One particularly scandalous record describes a group of Kizang trained to sing lullabies, specifically for after intimacy. These women were reserved for the highest-ranking officials. The idea? A serenade while you, cool down. One visitor from Ming, China wrote that Korean royal chambers were filled with music and soft voices, even when nothing required celebration. Subtle. You sit down at a lacquered bench where a Kizang might have played her Geogeum. The strings hum gently in your imagination. Some of these women became legends, like Huang Jini, whose poetry is still quoted today. Her verses were laced with double meanings, elegant wordplay, and low-key thirst traps. One of her most famous poems, written to a monk who had taken a vow of celibacy, ends with, "If even the moon follows me down the path, how can you say you must not?" Oof. That is 16th century burn right there. Yet despite their artistry and influence, Kizang were always walking a tightrope. They were adored but disposable, admired but restricted. One wrong move, one royal mood swing, and you could find yourself assigned to a remote garrison of bored soldiers. Not exactly the dream gig. There was even a phrase for it: to be exiled in silk. It meant being punished through unwanted favor. You might still wear beautiful clothes and eat well, but you'd be serving an old governor in a swampy province, your art reduced to background noise. And while men could visit Kizang openly, women in the court were banned from speaking their names aloud. It was considered too stirring. Yes, they literally feared casual mentions might make someone curious, or worse, envious. Even today, Kizang exists in the Korean cultural memory as both tragic and romantic figures. Their stories are layered, about survival, wit, and reclaiming fragments of power in a system rigged against them. One Kizing famously outwitted a corrupt official by challenging him to a poetry duel. When he lost, he had to let her go. Talk about weaponized rhymes. You lean back, imagining one of these women brushing rouge on her cheeks, tuning her instrument, and stepping into a candlelit room full of scheming nobles. It wasn't just a performance, it was survival art. And here's the quirky bit. Some Kizing weren't women at all. A rare but documented subset of male Kizing existed, often performing comedic or satirical roles at banquets. Their flirtation was theatrical, their dancing exaggerated, and their presence a paradox. While society rigidly defined gender roles, these performers somehow existed in a gray zone, mocked, loved, and occasionally quietly courted. You can't help but wonder, in a world where everything had rules, perhaps it was the performers, the Kizang, who found the only freedom in pretending not to be free. The sound of laughter seems to echo faintly off the chamber walls. Real or imagined, it's impossible to say.
You shuffle forward, the air thinning just slightly as you descend deeper into the memory of Korea's winding past. A breeze brushes your cheek, faint, perfumed with what might be powdered ginseng and burning sandalwood. You're entering a new kind of chamber now, less courtly, more clandestine. The flickering lamplight reveals carvings of wolves, snakes, and vines. You've stepped into the realm of shamanic rites, where sex wasn't sinful, but sacred. Hey, don't roll your eyes. This isn't some wishful New Age fantasy. Ancient Korea's spiritual practices, especially those of the Mudang female shamans, wove sexuality directly into their ceremonies. Not always overtly, but symbolically, rhythmically, and sometimes quite literally. In the earliest periods of Korean history, before Buddhism or Confucianism stiffened things up, spirituality was wild, earthy, and full of metaphor. A gut, or shamanic ritual, could include drumming, chanting, and ecstatic dancing that looked suspiciously like, well, interpretive foreplay. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Shamanism in Korea predates even the Three Kingdoms period. These women, often from the lower classes or outcast groups, were considered mediators between humans and the spirit world. They didn't just pray, they performed. And sometimes, their rituals mimicked union, representing harmony between divine forces. One such rite, called Narimgut, was used to induct new shamans. It included frenzied dancing, spirit possession, and intense physical expression. Observers often claimed that during these rituals, the shaman became married to the god. Some scholars argue that the language used in these ceremonies deliberately blurred the line between spiritual ecstasy and physical pleasure. Now, historians still argue whether some of these rites involved real physical intimacy or simply symbolic acts. There's no solid proof that sex occurred during public rituals, but descriptions from the Samguk Yusa, a 13th century Korean chronicle, hint at joining and offering of breath and body in ways that raise eyebrows even today. One fringe but fascinating tidbit: in remote mountain regions, there were tales of Mudang who claimed to sleep with forest spirits, beings of fertility, harvest, and seasonal power. These weren't ghost stories. These were honored traditions, passed down by women who saw their bodies as vessels for divine union. Kind of like Tinder, but the match is a pine tree god. You glance up at the ceiling, where faded murals show women in flowing robes twirling in spirals. Their hair is loose, their eyes closed, There's something primal here, less about seduction and more about surrender. There's one preserved chant from the Giola province that translates to, "I offer my voice, my pulse, and my breath. I open the river so the clouds may enter." Poetic, yes. Vague, very. But in the context of a culture where water symbolized femininity and clouds symbolized masculine energy, the innuendo's doing jumping jacks. Interestingly, these rituals often occurred in liminal spaces, forest clearings, mountaintops, caves, places that felt removed from daily life, where ordinary rules were suspended. That's where the magic happened. And that's where the people, nobles, commoners, everyone in between, came to seek healing, fertility, or guidance. One account tells of a noble woman unable to conceive. She was advised not to take more herbs or consult monks, but instead to participate in a gut to unblock her gates. The ritual included laughter, crying, and symbolic motions between two poles, yes, poles planted in the earth. Days later, she reportedly conceived. Coincidence? Maybe. But local belief credited the mudang, not medicine. It's important to note, though, that Confucian scholars were horrified by all this. As Confucianism took root in the Joseon dynasty, these shamanic practices were pushed underground. The official stance? Superstition. The actual concern? Probably that too much spiritual freedom might spill into social rebellion. Can't have people out here believing their bodies connect to gods. That's dangerous thinking. Yet the rituals persisted in secret, in countryside corners, in women's whispered songs passed down in kitchens and fields. Even today, shamanic ceremonies are still performed in Korea. Some are dramatic. Some are subdued. All carry the ghostly echo of a time when spirituality and sexuality were not enemies, but intertwined dancers. Now for a modern joke tucked in a stone wall, you imagine a present-day wellness influencer trying to rebrand this as K-ecstasy yoga. Ancient tradition, handcrafted herbal oils, $299 per session, BYO incense. Probably already exists on Etsy, let's be honest. But beneath the humor, there's a strange respect growing in your chest. These weren't orgies in the woods, they were structured, reverent experiences where bodies weren't seen as sinful, but sacred. Female bodies especially. The mudang held power not in spite of their gender, but because of it. You kneel before a small altar, carved with snakes and moons, and feel the residual pulse of drumbeats long silenced. Whether or not actual sex occurred during these rituals almost seems beside the point. The energy, the metaphor, the invitation to embody desire and transcendence, that's what survived. And in a world where so many people still struggle to feel at home in their own skin, that message lands heavy. Your body isn't a burden. It's a bridge.
The path forward twists now. Less like a corridor and more like a memory unfolding. The floor beneath your feet feels softer, as if worn down by countless others who passed through with questions unspoken. Your lantern's glow lands on an unexpected sight, a scroll hanging from the ceiling by red silk threads. You reach up, unroll it, and begin to read. It's a medical text, well, sort of. The calligraphy is fluid, careful, and clearly royal. This is not a commoner's diary or a monk's journal. This is court medicine, and the scroll bears the emblem of the Joseon Royal Clinic, the Wigway. You lean closer. The subject? Ailing men in the court and their private prescriptions, many of them centered on restoring sexual potency. Now, this isn't just about virility. In ancient Korea, a man's ability to perform was tied to far more than ego. It was linked to destiny, ancestral duty, and cosmic balance. If a king could not produce an heir, it wasn't just a family issue. It was a crisis for the entire nation. And so, the palace physicians got creative. Take the case of King Injo, whose reign was marked by chronic illness and deep anxiety, though not officially declared impotent. There are hints in royal documents of an inner coldness and weakness in the dragon's breath, metaphors that left little to the imagination. His physicians prescribed powdered deer antler, tiger bone, and a drink called Jonggingwan, made of dozens of herbs and, yes, crushed pearls. But the most fascinating part of the scroll is a section titled simply Night Restoratives. These weren't just aphrodisiacs. They were structured regimens for restoring yang energy, believed to be the source of masculine vitality. One tonic included eel liver, ginseng, and wine aged with the smoke of burned mandrake root. Another involved soaking in a bath of pine needles and ox blood, followed by a massage with hot stones wrapped in silk. Science may scoff, but belief is a powerful medicine. And belief wasn't limited to man. Royal concubines, too, were part of this web, selected not only for beauty but for supposed fertility. They underwent treatments to make them more receptive. Some involved acupuncture in, shall we say, uncomfortable places. Others required them to sleep on mats laced with minerals believed to increase conception. One particularly bizarre method involved painting the soles of their feet with red clay, thought to warm the womb from below. It gets stranger. The scroll tells of astrological sex schedules, where couples were only permitted or encouraged to have intercourse on nights when the moon was in a favorable house. A concubine's success might hinge not on affection or attraction, but on the correct alignment of Venus and the Ox constellation. One palace document details how a court eunuch was tasked with tracking the sexual calendar for the king. Imagine the job description: lunar cycle analyst and royal arousal facilitator. Talk about performance reviews. And speaking of eunuchs, this scroll hints at a peculiar twist. Some eunuchs, despite castration, were believed to have retained hidden potency. This led to suspicion, jealousy, and even execution when a concubine became pregnant and the paternity was unclear. In one recorded scandal, a eunuch named Jang Jian was tortured for days after whispers suggested he had reawakened his dragon tail. The truth was never proven, but his death was a warning. You roll the scroll closed, hands tingling with what you just read. These weren't just ancient myths or erotic fantasies. This was medical policy, statecraft, and metaphysical insurance wrapped in secrecy. The ancient Koreans saw sexual energy as life force, not embarrassment. The body wasn't isolated from the cosmos. It was a mirror of it. If your yang was low, maybe the stars were misaligned. If conception failed, perhaps the wood element in your liver was too dry. And thus, treatment involved not just herbs and baths, but ritual, rhythm, and belief. You rise slowly, feeling like you just walked through a pharmacy designed by shamans and astrologers. A funny modern thought pops into your head. Imagine submitting a health insurance claim today for tiger bone wine and starlight massage. Rejected faster than you can say sinew tonic. And yet, perhaps there's something deeply human here that's been lost. A time when the body's mysteries weren't shamed, but studied. When arousal wasn't private, but spiritual. And when kings feared not scandal, but cosmic imbalance. Your lantern dims slightly as if even the light is blushing. But the hallway ahead glows faintly gold. Another story waits, another truth, half whispered, still warm with memory.
The corridor tilts ever so slightly, as though pulling you downward, not in fear, but into intrigue. The gold-hued glow ahead flickers like candlelight seen through rice paper. You follow it, brushing aside strands of history that feel strangely fresh, like breath on your neck. Another room opens, smaller than the last, yet lined with folding screens, each painted with couples in soft embrace, birds in flight, peaches ripe on their branches. A hush falls over the space, and for a moment you wonder if you've walked into something sacred or scandalous. On the central dais rests a jade box with a silver clasp, the kind reserved for nobility. You open it. Inside are letters, all written by hand in fine ink, addressed with titles like Lady of the Moon Courtyard or Fourth Consort of the Inner Garden. These are the love letters of concubines, but not the swooning kind Hollywood loves. No, these are requests for transfer, subtle accusations, power plays disguised as longing. You realize you've entered the political hotbed of the royal harem. The Joseon dynasty, with its emphasis on Confucian morality, ran on hierarchy. Nowhere was this more cutthroat than among the king's consorts. While outwardly serene, the inner court was a seething arena of competition, not only for affection, but for status, security, and survival. And the rules? Let's just say the Hunger Games had fewer guidelines. Concubines were ranked in 9 formal levels, from bin, senior rank, to sangung, attendants. But behind those titles were whispered alliances, backroom deals, and if this letter is any hint, a few creative strategies for seduction. Take this one. A senior concubine writes of how she mixed silkworm extract with honey and applied it to her skin before visiting the king. It wasn't just skincare, it gave her a luminous glow under lantern light. Her goal? To appear as the moon in fog, subtle yet unforgettable. Not a bad beauty hack, honestly. But beauty alone wasn't enough. In one scroll, a woman outlines the use of coded fans, delicate handheld fans painted with flowers that signaled secret meanings. A peony might suggest fertility. A bamboo stalk bent just so might mean obedience, or flexibility, depending on your interpretation. A well-timed flick of the fan could be the difference between banishment and a royal summons. Historians still argue whether these symbols were officially taught or organically developed, but most agree that court concubines mastered the art of weaponized femininity. And it wasn't all coquetry, some letters contained sharp warnings. One notes that another consort was pouring vinegar in the chrysanthemum water, a euphemism that makes modern office drama look tame. You move to the next screen and nearly chuckle aloud. It's painted with a training session not for soldiers, but for junior concubines. There they are, lined up in rows, balancing books on their heads and practicing the graceful kneel. A court lady taps their shoulders if they wobble. 1 foot slightly forward, shoulders down, eyes demure. It's the royal equivalent of charm school, but the stakes? Way higher. And yes, the curriculum extended beyond posture. Concubines received lessons in intimacy, often from older women called neighing, who were once consorts themselves. Think of them as retired players turned coaches. Their lessons covered how to read the king's mood, how to anticipate desires without overstepping, and this one's gold, how to pretend to fall asleep artfully so as not to appear too eager. Of course, all of this begs the question, did the king know? Was he aware of the performances, the silent battles, the fermented bean paste accidentally spilled on a rival's robe? Likely yes, because among the many roles of the court eunuchs was serving as the king's informants within the harem. One particularly juicy document tells of a eunuch who kept a scorecard, rating the concubines not just on physical beauty, but conversation, emotional stability, and scent. You can almost hear the reality show theme song now, The Real Concubines of Gyeongbokgung. And if a concubine rose too quickly, she might be accused of using sorcery, a serious charge. One woman, rumored to have bewitched the king with charms made of crushed magnolia and frog skin, disappeared overnight. Whether exiled or executed, no one knows. But her chamber was sealed, and her name erased from the records. Still, not all tales are tragic. One letter, sweet and shy, thanks the king for a single evening. No request for favor, no veiled complaint, just the joy of having been noticed. It ends with, even if never again, I have already dreamed enough. You close the jade box, the scent of old ink and rice paper lingering in the air. The harem was a world of its own, equal parts finishing school, battlefield, and stage. It reminds you that in ancient Korea, power wore perfume, and silence spoke volumes. A gust of warm air brushes your cheek. A screen slides open on its own. Your journey presses on, into the world beyond lovers, the realm of rule makers and rule breakers.
You drift into a corridor with walls of soft green silk and golden trim, where the scent of lotus oil lingers. It's quieter here, somehow cooler, as though the air itself is holding its breath. The next chamber ahead isn't adorned with fans or painted scrolls. Instead, it's filled with books, bound in bamboo, silk, and paper, stacked neatly on lacquered shelves. But these aren't histories or poetry anthologies. These are manuals, some worn from repeated handling, others so pristine they may never have been read. A low table holds one open volume, revealing diagrams of the human body, both male and female, marked with lines, pressure points, and notes in Hangul and classical Chinese. You've stumbled upon one of ancient Korea's best-kept secrets, the intersection of sex and science. While Confucianism dictated public morality, behind palace walls, Korea's medical elite were deeply engaged in understanding how intimacy affected the mind and body. This wasn't just about pleasure. It was about balance of qi energy, blood, and essence. You pick up a volume titled Secret Methods for Harmonizing Yin and Yang. It was written for nobility by court physicians, men sworn to silence, often eunuchs themselves, trained in both herbal medicine and subtle observation. One section outlines how different sexual positions could affect digestion, fertility, and even dreams. Another warns against over-harmonizing, especially for men over 40. Their essence, once depleted, was thought difficult to restore. For women, it was the opposite. Ancient Korean beliefs, some imported from Chinese Taoist traditions, held that a woman's sexual essence was replenishing, while a man's was limited. Therefore, a man might grow weak from frequent intercourse, while a woman might grow radiant. Some manuals even suggest that older men seek out younger women to borrow their essence, although this was always framed as dangerous if done without spiritual alignment. And yes, there were potions for all of this. You find a scroll listing ingredients for the 9-petal wine, said to enhance female arousal. It includes cinnamon, ginger root, crushed rose petals, and a touch of ginseng, aged in rice wine for 49 days. Another tonic, tiger bone elixir, was banned outside the palace. It was said to strengthen male virility, though modern historians suspect it was more placebo than potion. But the science wasn't all sensual. One slim volume details contraceptive methods, rare but existent. Some concubines were given herbal concoctions to prevent pregnancy when bearing a royal child might complicate succession. Others, hoping to become mothers, were instructed in precise timing of intercourse based on lunar cycles. Fertility wasn't chance, it was a strategy. And then there were the dream therapists. Yes, they were real. Certain women in the court, especially widowed queens or elderly concubines, were said to experience troubling dreams, often erotic in nature. Rather than dismissing them as sin or fantasy, healers treated these dreams as signs of internal imbalance. One report speaks of a queen who dreamed of swimming in moonlit rivers, chased by koi fish. Her physician prescribed mulberry tea and nightly walks under stars. Within weeks, the dream ceased. You sit cross-legged on a cushion and flip through another book, this one filled with aphorisms. Touch without touch. This is the highest art. The tongue is a brush, the skin a scroll. Where silence resides, sound becomes sacred. The phrasing is poetic, but you sense a deeper truth. Intimacy in ancient Korea wasn't just physical. It was energetic, even spiritual. It could heal, manipulate, elevate, or destroy. One legend, preserved in the back of the room, tells of a king whose favorite concubine died young, devastated. He commissioned a statue of her, not marble but perfumed wood, carved with her likeness. He kept it in his chamber, speaking to it nightly, burning incense and offering poems. The court physicians declared there's a sickness of the soul called empty silk illness. He was prescribed isolation, fasting, and immersion in cold water until the delusion passed. You close the final volume and stand. Around you, the room feels timeless, a place where desire met discipline, and where the body's secret language was studied like a sacred text. It's oddly comforting to know they sought understanding, not judgment, in the mysteries of touch, longing, and connection. The silk curtains at the far end of the chamber sway gently. Another door opens, beckoning you deeper into stories not just of intimacy or power, but of how the body remembers what history forgets.
You step through the swaying silk curtain and into a smaller, candlelit chamber, this one lined not with books, but with mirrors. They lean at odd angles on carved wooden stands, some warped by time, others glinting sharp and new. Your own reflection flickers back at you, but you hardly recognize it, cloaked now in the mystery of everything you've seen so far. And in the center of the room, laid out like an altar, rests a folded silk robe, crimson and embroidered with gold peonies. This isn't just a dressing room. It's a preparation chamber, a space for ritual, reflection, and reinvention. In ancient Korea, especially during the Joseon dynasty, sex within the palace wasn't always spontaneous. It was often ceremonial, especially between royals. Before physical union, both partners might undergo purification, washing with lotus-infused water, burning sage or mugwort, and donning special garments meant to balance energies. You can practically smell the smoky sweetness of the incense now, mixing with wax and wood. But this room wasn't just for purification. It was also a testing ground. Some nobles believed that one's scent, body temperature, or energy fields could determine compatibility. There were even tales of women pressing their palms together with potential lovers, reading the warmth or coolness like a spiritual thermometer. Too cold. No harmony. Too hot. Danger of imbalance. Historians still argue whether this was symbolic or taken literally, but either way, it governed who touched whom and when. On one lacquered shelf, you spot a collection of small wooden masks, delicately painted, eerily beautiful. They represent figures from Korean shamanic tradition: fox spirits, mountain ghosts, and celestial maidens. These weren't Halloween props. Sometimes, nobles or temple initiates wore masks during intimate encounters, not just for roleplay, but as a way of channeling archetypes. Imagine it: a noble woman embodying a gumiho, the mythical nine-tailed fox who seduces and tests the hearts of men. Or a high-ranking official donning a deer mask to represent fertility and renewal. The act wasn't just sex. It was theater, myth made flesh. In one dusty corner sits a small bronze gong. According to palace law, a concubine would strike the gong once when she felt emotionally ready to be visited by the king. If she wasn't chosen, no harm. But if she was, a procession would form, handmaidens carrying oils, musicians playing soft gayam strings, and the concubine herself walking barefoot through the moonlit corridor to the royal bedchamber. It's all very romantic until you remember this was still a world steeped in hierarchy and patriarchy. Most concubines didn't choose their positions. Many were offered by noble families seeking favor, or taken from distant provinces under the guise of opportunity. While some rose to great power, others faded into obscurity, used and discarded like silk napkins at a noble feast. One particularly haunting tale speaks of a concubine who bore the crown prince, only to be poisoned a year later by the queen's jealous brother. Her name was stricken from records. Her belongings burned. Her son raised by another woman. You exhale slowly, your breath fogging the nearest mirror. But it wasn't all tragedy. In more rural areas of the peninsula, away from court politics, ordinary Koreans developed their own rituals, often far more egalitarian. Some villages celebrated spring fertility festivals where couples would light lanterns, drink makgeolli rice wine, and share their stories beside bonfires. The elders would bless young lovers with rice tossed like confetti, and the oldest couple in the village would be asked to share their wisdom on love, usually with a wink and a cup of wine. And in these small communities, sexuality wasn't just a private matter. It was woven into the fabric of survival: how families formed, how land was passed down, how alliances were made. The stakes were different here. More human. More raw. You turn, and something catches your eye: a scroll half unfurled on the ground, its edge kissed by candlelight. You crouch to read the visible line. Desire is a thread, soft, fragile, but binding the heavens to the earth. Maybe that's the thread you've been following all along. Through myths and manuals, masks and medicine, you've been tugged gently through a culture where sex wasn't just taboo or sacred, it was both, and everything in between. It was how people survived loneliness, how they reached for power, how they marked their time on earth. As the candles flicker lower, a distant breeze rustles through the curtain behind you. One final mirror reflects the curve of your shoulder, softened by firelight. You're not who you were when you entered. You're more curious now, and perhaps just a little more awake.
You slide past a whispering curtain and find yourself standing in what feels like a forgotten theater. Low platforms and cushions arranged in a half moon, like a gathering space for rituals or stories, long since abandoned. You pause, the wooden floorboards faintly creaking beneath your steps. Overhead, the scent of burnt jasmine and pine smoke lingers. Something ceremonial must have taken place here, though what kind, you're not quite sure. It's in this space that one of the strangest, most whispered about practices unfolded, one that modern historians still approach with arched brows and tentative translation. The ancient Korean belief in sexual transference of spiritual power, or Jong Gi Gilwan. You kneel beside a low lacquered table and trace your fingers over its surface. Embedded in the wood are delicate carvings of cranes, tigers, and lotus blossoms, each symbol holding meaning. Cranes, longevity. Tigers, strength. Lotuses, rebirth. Fitting, given what happened here. In some esoteric circles, especially among fringe shamanic sects and Taoist-influenced scholars, it was believed that one could exchange GI, life energy, through physical intimacy. But not just any intimacy. This wasn't your average secret tryst under moonlight. This was ritualized, timed with the lunar calendar. Sometimes practiced between students and masters. Sometimes between spiritual equals. Always cloaked in layers of metaphor and secrecy. The idea that men and women could balance their internal elements, yin and yang, through guided sexual rites. A man nearing collapse from exhaustion might seek a union with a woman said to possess moon essence, believed to cool and restore. A woman losing her vitality might seek a man with dragon fire to reignite her strength. One fringe document, its authenticity still debated, describes a night-long ceremony where no climax was allowed. The goal was to build pressure, circulate energy, and awaken latent senses. According to that text, breaking the ritual by finishing too soon was said to scatter the soul like spilled rice. Yikes! No pressure. And here's the kicker. Some healers claim these unions could cure physical illnesses, that a sacred partner could pulse energy into failing organs, chase bad spirits from blood, or mend psychological wounds. Of course, historians still argue whether this was pseudoscience, proto-psychotherapy, or spiritual metaphor taken too literally. Likely it was a mix of all three. On one tattered scroll, hanging limply on the wall, you spot an ink-brush proverb. Shared breath is stronger than solo fire. Romantic, or just weirdly flammable. You settle onto a cushion, imagining how this room must have felt centuries ago. Quiet breath, rhythmic drumming, chanting somewhere outside the walls, and two people locked not in lust, but in something more curious. Not performance, not power, just a fragile attempt to balance what the world unbalanced. But of course, not every practice was so mystical. In some households, particularly noble ones, there were superstitions passed down through generations. Rules like never sleep with your feet pointing north, lest you invite the ancestors to watch. Avoid intimacy on the 8th day of the lunar month, unless you wanted twins, or a fox spirit baby. And most peculiar of all, if a rooster crowed before the act was finished, one of you was cursed to age 10 years overnight, which may explain a lot about grumpy old palace guards. You chuckle softly, then notice something tucked into the corner behind a paper screen. A pair of wooden dolls tied together with red thread. These were symbolic tokens, given to newlyweds, travelers, or couples trying to conceive. One doll male, one female, though sometimes both were gender neutral. The red thread, a reference to the old myth of the invisible red string, a belief that destined lovers were bound by a thread visible only to the gods. You lift the dolls. They're worn smooth by age and touch, but their faces are still faintly smiling. Perhaps, in their own wooden way, they've seen it all. And it's worth noting, while Confucian doctrine tried to regulate behavior, especially sexual behavior, the people of Korea found ways to keep folk wisdom and spiritual intimacy alive. Even when suppressed, these practices slipped through cracks, whispered through generations, hidden in poetry, etched in secret manuals passed between curious friends or nervous students. And in those pages, not just instructions, but hope, connection, curiosity, because at its heart, this wasn't just about bodies. It was about what people did with their loneliness, their yearning, their mystery. It was about turning something as private as pleasure into something as sacred as balance. The candlelight flickers again. The smoke above you curls upward, taking with it the scent of forgotten rituals and the soft hum of old intentions. Somewhere in the distance, you hear the faint tap of drums, real or imagined, who knows? And you close your eyes for a moment, feeling something old and nameless pressed gently against the edge of your awareness. Whatever you call it, magic, memory, or just good storytelling, it's alive in you now.
You wander down a narrow hallway lit by floating lanterns that seem suspended in air without wires or hooks. The walls here are paper-thin, literally hanji. Traditional Korean paper made from mulberry bark separates one memory from another. As you pass each panel, soft shadows flicker behind them. Silent scenes from history, played out in silhouette. Then one shadow moves a little too naturally. You stop. Listen. A hush, like held breath. And then it begins again, your journey through another peculiar corner of ancient Korean intimacy. This time, the setting isn't royal. It's rural. A quiet village nestled in the southern provinces, far from palace gates and scholar scrolls. Here, in the dim rice fog mornings and ink-black evenings, folk beliefs ruled the heart far more than royal decree. And at the center of those beliefs, animal spirits. Specifically, the myth of the kumiho, or nine-tailed fox. You've probably heard her name before, sometimes romanticized, often feared. The kumiho was said to be a shapeshifter, a fox who lived 1,000 years and could become a stunning woman. In many tales, she seduced men not out of love but hunger for their livers, or occasionally their souls. But in some lesser-known versions of the myth, the foxwoman's motives were more nuanced. She didn't want to kill. She wanted to become human. And the only way to do that, earn the heart of a man without devouring him. A tricky balance. So how does this connect to sexuality? You find yourself in a village storyteller's hut, walls lined with carved masks and jars of dried herbs. These oral tales were passed from grandmother to child, whispered near the fire, always with a wink of danger. In some stories, it was said that if a man could survive 100 nights of union with a kumiho without being tricked, she would turn mortal and bring him untold blessings. But if he faltered, even once, if he let his guard down, he'd be found lifeless in the rice fields at dawn. These stories weren't just myths. They shaped real behaviors. Young women with sharp eyes or unusual grace might be called fox spirits by jealous neighbors. Men who became reclusive after a lover disappeared were said to have met the tale. The fox became a metaphor for lust, for the danger of desire, for the mysteries men feared and women embodied. One tattered folktale you pick up tells of a widower who fell in love with a beautiful woman who appeared at his door during a snowstorm. She was quiet, demure, and always left before dawn. For weeks, they shared warmth under his quilts. But he began to weaken. His appetite faded. His dreams were strange. Finally, a shaman was called. The diagnosis? Not heartbreak, not illness, but spiritual drainage, his soul slowly licked away by a hungry fox's invisible tongue. You set the tale down and shiver slightly. Even if it's folklore, there's something primal about it. The idea that intimacy can nourish or destroy, that love might be a gift or a trap. Then again, these fox tales weren't always warnings. In some regions, couples left offerings to fox spirits asking for fertility. A carved talisman, a bowl of rice wine, a red sash tied to a tree. Some believed fox spirits could bless a barren woman or give a man dreams of his future bride. Duality was the theme. Foxes were dangerous, but also wise. Lustful, but loyal if appeased. You move to the back of the room and find a mirror, framed in bamboo and jade. It's cloudy with age, but your reflection appears slowly. Not just your face, but something layered. A suggestion of another figure just behind you. Feminine. Pale. Smiling, but not kindly. Just for a second. Then she's gone. A trick of the candlelight? Or a clever reminder from the Kumiho herself? You can't tell. Outside the hut, the night deepens. Crickets sing in the dark, and a soft fog curls along the ground like a creature seeking warmth. You remember the proverb. Desire that burns too long calls the fox to your door. And tonight, as the shadows stretch and the stars blink one by one into view, you wonder how many lonely villagers, aching for connection, called her name in silence. Not out of fear, but out of longing. Because sometimes, even a myth with claws can feel like the only thing that understands.
The night air presses gently against your skin now, like silk being drawn across the nape of your neck. As you move forward, the paper walls and village shadows dissolve behind you, and a new environment unfolds. Cold stone, damp moss, and the scent of ancient incense. You've entered the monastery grounds, where the wind no longer carries laughter or music, but chants, soft, rhythmic, otherworldly. It's the early hours of morning in the mountains of ancient Korea, a time when even birds hesitate to sing. Here, desire wasn't indulged. It was confronted, caged, and, if one had enough discipline, eradicated, or so the monks hoped. You walk past a seated monk, his robe wrapped tight, eyes closed in meditation. But beneath the surface calm, there's tension, like a hell breath or confession too long buried. And that's where you come in, following the lesser-known story of Buddhist celibacy and the surprising rituals that came with it. Let's start with the basics. Korean Buddhism, like many branches, encouraged detachment from worldly pleasures that included wealth, fame, and yes, carnal intimacy. Monks were expected to take vows of celibacy and spend their lives seeking enlightenment through study and asceticism. But, as you're probably guessing, things weren't always that simple. Some monasteries, particularly remote ones during the Goryeo period, developed ritual cleansing practices designed to purge impure thoughts. These rituals can involve icy mountain baths, fasting, or even self-flagellation. Yes, literally whipping oneself with knotted cords or bamboo canes to quell lustful urges. Imagine trying that instead of just blocking your ex's number. And yet, the real twist wasn't the severity of the methods. It was the questionable results. Historical records describe monks struggling with recurring dreams, especially in their first few years of training. These weren't peaceful dreams of bodhisattvas or golden lotuses. They were vivid, heated, and often involved faceless women whispering unspeakable things. One monk, in a surviving scroll, confessed that he dreamt nightly of a woman turning into smoke, wrapping around his body, and laughing as he tried to recite scriptures. Charming. Now, you might be wondering, why not just let it go? But here's the kicker. These monks believed that these dreams weren't just the mind's tricks, but attacks from demons or fox spirits in disguise, testing their resolve. So what did they do about it? Well, in one now-lost monastery near Mount Sirach, they devised a method known simply as the Vigil of 9 Lamps. The concept was oddly sensual for a ritual meant to kill desire. Monks would surround themselves with 9 softly glowing lamps, stripped to the waist, and meditate in front of a polished bronze mirror. The idea was to stare at one's reflection, acknowledge every craving, every shameful thought, and, through sheer force of focus, burn it away. Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes they passed out from hunger. Occasionally, a lamp went out on its own, and that was considered a bad omen. If more than 2 extinguished themselves, it was said the monk had lost the fight that night. And still, despite all this effort, historians note that some temples were known for quiet scandals. There were whispered stories of monks sneaking off into nearby villages, of novices falling in love with temple maids or with each other, of secret letters exchanged under rice paper doors. Historians still argue whether these scandals were rare exceptions or quietly tolerated parts of monastic life. One temple ledger even shows an unusually high turnover of novice monks each spring. Curious timing, considering it followed the long, cold, and isolating Korean winters. You pause before an ancient stone gate now, its surface carved with lotus blossoms and tiny foxes you wouldn't notice unless you squinted. Maybe it's symbolic. Maybe someone just got bored during renovations. But it feels like a quiet wink from the past. You reach out and touch the stone. It's cool, almost humming under your fingers. A reminder that even the most sacred spaces carry shadows, especially when those shadows were meant to be denied, not explored. In modern times, the myth of celibate monk persists, polished and proud. But deep inside the historical scrolls, scratched in between the chants and mantras, lies another truth. Suppression doesn't erase longing. It just drives it underground. And in those hidden tunnels, under flickering candlelight, whole other worlds once bloomed.
You step deeper now, through the monastery's back gate, and find yourself facing a dense grove of pine. The needles glitter faintly in the moonlight, slick with dew, and each step muffles under a cushion of fallen leaves. It's quiet here, too quiet, the kind that wraps around your ankles and whispers that something hidden is watching. You push forward. Beneath your feet lies a part of Korea's past that few talk about, not temples or palaces, but the private sanctuaries of Yangban aristocrats. These were the upper crust, the scholarly elite, living in sprawling hanok homes, with scroll-filled libraries, inner gardens, and most intriguing of all, hidden chambers. Because you see, while monks battled lust with fire and fasting, the upper classes, well, they took a different approach. In elite circles, sexuality was often bound up in ritual, poetry, and, believe it or not, science. This brings you to one of the most unusual relics of ancient Korean aristocracy, the Manual of Bedroom Arts. Not quite what you'd expect to find between treatises on Confucian ethics and geomancy, but there it was, a guide passed quietly among noble households, written in elegant calligraphy, complete with delicate ink drawings that left very little to the imagination. According to these manuals, pleasure was a pursuit of harmony. Intercourse wasn't just for procreation, it was a form of cosmic balance, of yin and yang uniting in the flesh. Very philosophical. Very sweaty. Now, imagine you're a 17th century nobleman, lying on a lacquered floor with your concubine, candlelight dancing across the paper windows. You've just had a long day writing poems about chrysanthemums and dodging imperial tax collectors. And now it's time to apply a technique referred to as the cloud hides the moon. You're not entirely sure what it means, but the drawing suggests something acrobatic and definitely ankle-related. These guides weren't just creative, they were grounded in Taoist beliefs imported from China, which emphasized control, restraint, and a kind of metaphysical finesse. For instance, men were encouraged to delay climax indefinitely to preserve their essence, while women were seen as vessels of powerful yin energy that could literally rejuvenate a man's spirit if he played his cards right. Talk about pressure. Of course, not every nobleman was a willing scholar of these arts. Some reportedly faked headaches or feigned indigestion to escape the elaborate bedroom choreography expected of them. And while the manuals were theoretically meant for married couples, historians still debate how widely they were shared among mistresses, courtesans, or even male companions. One surviving copy contains a note scribbled in the margins, possibly by a bored scholar, reading, "Works better if she likes you." And yes, that counts as your quirky tidbit for the night. But the real drama came when these private pleasures collided with public expectation. Because while the young ban were encouraged to produce heirs, they were also under intense moral scrutiny. Adultery? A crime. Open bisexuality? Legally punishable. A noble woman caught being unfaithful could be banished, or worse. A nobleman, however, often received a stern talking to and maybe a slightly colder soup. There are court records of secret trials, scandalous poetry that hinted at forbidden trysts, and even a mysterious case where an entire family estate was confiscated because a noblewoman was found to have been involved with 2 musicians. At once. Double shame. Double flute solo. As you walk past the grove and toward the flicker of candlelight beyond a wooden gate, a scene materializes. A noble woman seated behind a screen, her silhouette cast in soft gold. In her lap, a book, maybe it's a manual, maybe a volume of love poems. Her expression unreadable. Her thoughts, possibly scandalous. Because here's the deeper truth. In the polished, rule-bound world of aristocracy, people were still human. They yearned, they strayed, they loved dangerously. And even when society wrapped desire in silk and calligraphy, it still pulsed, warm and unruly, beneath the surface. So the next time someone tells you ancient history was boring, remember this. Behind every stoic portrait and austere lineage scroll, there were tangled bedsheets, whispered names, and hearts that didn't always follow the rules.
The air cools as you approach the outskirts of the noble quarter. Stone paths worn smooth by the passage of countless feet, pine branches swaying above like slow metronomes. Each step seems to press deeper into the forgotten chambers of the past. But now, with the end drawing near, you descend into one of the most peculiar layers of this hidden world. The underground economies of love, and those who made their living on the margins of official desire. You slip past the gate left ajar, and there, tucked behind a crumbling wall, lies a hammock smaller than the rest. No scrolls or calligraphy here, just candlelight, silk cushions, and a perfume that lingers in the air like smoke after a fire. Welcome to Courtesan's house, where protocol bent, poetry flourished, and pleasure was traded like silk. These weren't your average tavern entertainers. Known as jissying, these women were trained in music, dance, calligraphy, chess, and quietly, emotional seduction. Think of them as a cultural elite's guilty pleasure, educated enough to quote Confucius, charming enough to outthink a general, and when it suited them, able to twist a nobleman's heart like rice paper in rain. You sit down on a low cushion as music spills from behind a bamboo screen. A jissying sings a slow Panzori ballad, her voice raw with longing, and next to her, a scholar, red-faced with wine and blushing deeper from her gaze. This, right here, was one of the strangest paradoxes in Joseon, Korea. Public morality demanded rigid sexual discipline, yet a thriving underground culture celebrated the opposite behind paper doors. While Confucian code viewed women as passive, subservient, and chaste, jissying were paid, handsomely, for being bold, witty, and devastatingly clever. Some rose to fame, influencing politics through their lovers. Others disappeared, their stories lost except for whispered poems or old registers. And among them, rare and curious, were male courtesans, shadowy figures trained for select patrons, operating with even more secrecy. Historians still argue whether these men were true fixtures of elite nightlife or simply fictional inventions from scandalous literature. One surviving folktale speaks of a moonlit dancer who could recite poetry with his eyes and undo a nobleman's belt with his fan. Whether real or imagined, he remains a whisper in the nation's memory. But this gray space between the official and the illicit gave rise to strange contradictions. Officials who publicly condemned indecent behavior often maintained secret liaisons. In some towns, entire neighborhoods were unofficially dedicated to romantic recreation, complete with bathhouses, tea rooms, and conversation specialists who offered philosophical debate alongside companionship. The most shocking part? The records were kept meticulously. City ledgers logged wine expenses, bathhouse visits, and even musical requests. One ledger from 1793 includes a line item: 2-night stay, plum wine, song request, love beneath the peach tree. Either a beautiful getaway or the world's most poetic invoice. And then came the royal scandals. One prince reportedly maintained an entire troupe of disguised jissying, whom he kept in a summer palace under fake names. Another noble family was quietly dissolved after a feud involving twin courtesans and a disputed love poem. Yet, for all the gossip and danger, these clandestine worlds offered something rare: agency, artistry, and the possibility of forbidden joy in an age that prized silence and submission. You lean back, letting the scent of sandalwood curl around you. The night hums low. A cat slips past your ankles and disappears into the grass, chasing moonlight. And in this quiet, final moment, you understand the story of ancient Korea isn't just one of dynasty's military campaigns or palace intrigue. It's also a story of hidden hearts, of coded poems, of desire blooming in the shadows, where every glance had weight and every whisper could unravel a legacy. The air cools as you approach the outskirts of the noble quarter. Stone paths worn smooth by the passage of countless feet, pine branches swaying above like slow metronomes. Each step seems to press deeper into the forgotten chambers of the past. But now, with the end drawing near, you descend into one of the most peculiar layers of this hidden world, the underground economies of love, and those who made their living on the margins of official desire. You slip past a gate left ajar, and there, tucked behind a crumbling wall, lies a hammock smaller than the rest. No scrolls or calligraphy here, just candlelight, silk cushions, and a perfume that lingers in the air like smoke after a fire. Welcome to Courtesan's house, where protocol bent, poetry flourished, and pleasure was traded like silk. These weren't your average tavern entertainers. Known as jissying, these women were trained in music, dance, calligraphy, chess, and, quietly, emotional seduction. Think of them as a cultural elite's guilty pleasure, educated enough to quote Confucius, charming enough to outdrink a general, and, when it suited them, able to twist a nobleman's heart like rice paper in rain. You sit down on a low cushion as music spills from behind a bamboo screen. A jissying sings a slow Panzori ballad, her voice raw with longing, and next to her, a scholar, red-faced with wine and blushing deeper from her gaze. This, right here, was one of the strangest paradoxes in Joseon, Korea. Public morality demanded rigid sexual discipline, yet a thriving underground culture celebrated the opposite behind paper doors. While Confucian code viewed women as passive, subservient, and chaste, jissying were paid, handsomely, for being bold, witty, and devastatingly clever. Some rose to fame, influencing politics through their lovers. Others disappeared, their stories lost except for whispered poems or old registers. And among them, rare and curious, were male courtesans, shadowy figures trained for select patrons, operating with even more secrecy. Historians still argue whether these men were true fixtures of elite nightlife or simply fictional inventions from scandalous literature. One surviving folktale speaks of a moonlit dancer who could recite poetry with his eyes and undo a nobleman's belt with his fan. Whether real or imagined, he remains a whisper in the nation's memory. But this gray space between the official and the illicit gave rise to strange contradictions. Officials who publicly condemned indecent behavior often maintained secret liaisons. In some towns, entire neighborhoods were unofficially dedicated to romantic recreation, complete with bathhouses, tea rooms, and conversation specialists who offered philosophical debate alongside companionship. The most shocking part? The records were kept meticulously. City ledgers logged wine expenses, bathhouse visits, and even musical requests. One ledger from 1793 includes a line item: 2-night stay, plum wine, song request, love beneath the peach tree. Either a beautiful getaway or the world's most poetic invoice. And then came the royal scandals. One prince reportedly maintained an entire troupe of disguised jissying, whom he kept in a summer palace under fake names. Another noble family was quietly dissolved after a feud involving twin courtesans and a disputed love poem. Yet, for all the gossip and danger, these clandestine worlds offered something rare: agency, artistry, and the possibility of forbidden joy in an age that prized silence and submission. You lean back, letting the scent of sandalwood curl around you. The night hums low. A cat slips past your ankles and disappears into the grass, chasing moonlight. And in this quiet, final moment, you understand the story of ancient Korea isn't just one of dynasty's military campaigns or palace intrigue. It's also a story of hidden hearts, of coded poems, of desire blooming in the shadows. where every glance had weight and every whisper could unravel a legacy.